family members or adults say, play this game, it's so fantastic.
Shadow Temple is terrifying.
I
still get scared. Re-Deads, when I was a kid, like, every time they do that little shriek thing and you're, like, stunned for a second, like, still to this day, but when I was a kid, it terrified me.
The sound of the hands in the Shadow Temple, it still sends a shiver up my spine. It's one of the creepiest things I've ever seen in the game.
Hi, I'm John, and I'm a gamer.
Hi, John!
Gaming has come a long way over the last several decades. The debate on whether the medium is art has largely ended with a very conclusive yes, and around the world we're finally seeing people treat it with more of the respect that it deserves. With that in mind, and because I'm just as much of a game talker as I am a game player, I went around to all my gamer buddies to enlist their help in discussing games as art. So, if you love gaming as much as I do, then join us. Trust me, you're among friends. Listen in as we discuss the themes, gameplay, and whatever else comes to mind. It's like a book club, but gaming. Today's topic: The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time.
Hi, and welcome to the Book Club Gaming Podcast. I'm your host, John, and with me today are Adrien.
Hey there.
BC.
Hello.
And we're going to talk about some nerd shit. In particular, we're going to be covering Ocarina of Time, the first Legend of Zelda on Nintendo 64. All right, so let's get started. You guys ready to talk about some nerd shit?
Oh,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Awesome. So before we get going, I do want to play this little soundbite for you and just get your opinions. All right, so listening to that, I just want to know right off the bat, what emotions do you feel? And if they're nostalgic or current, like what does that bring to mind?
So for me, I mean, I can think back to the first time I turned on Ocarina of Time, back when I was a kid, and just the sense of wonder, the sense of space that just the title screen showed you. Up until then, most title screens were just sort of the game. I mean, a lot of games didn't even have title screens, or it was just a basic, start game sort of thing. While Ocarina of Time, you have Hyrule Field, you have Epona, riding through it. I mean, it's just a really incredible way of setting just the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, similar to that. Very, very nostalgic and taking me back to that childhood moments of just playing the game and learning a little bit about the world through that title sequence. Definitely, and even in my head, I can hear the clip-clop of Epona, as because for the folks who have seen it, there's a clip of Link, like as the sun is coming up, just riding through Hyrule Field as an adult on Epona, and the clip-clopping of the hooves and everything. It's a very, very nostalgic feeling. And interestingly enough, it also is not the first time, or excuse me, it's probably the first time, but it's definitely not the last time that Nintendo did that with one of their Zelda games. Like in Twilight Princess, they do something very, very similar, where it has Link riding Epona, riding across Hyrule Fields, across the bridges and everything, and the end sequence is Wolf Link howling to the barrier between the World of Light and the Twilight World as the logo for the game Twilight Princess comes up on screen.
Definitely.
Right before it launches into the cinematic sequence to introduce the game more.
So you can definitely tell that Nintendo learned a lot about how to set up an adventure, and visually the representation there of like how to set up that open space, all of that started here. And one really cool thing I like about that visual aspect of it, and I know I was kind of missing the clip-clop of Epona's heels as well, is that Epona herself is a completely optional part of the game. Like, you could play the entire game feasibly and not even know that she's in it, if it weren't for that introductory little screen. For me, listening to the music I think about just how calm and it's a lot of Zelda games will kind of jump in with like a really high intensity music right away. But for me, like this kind of sets you up. Like this is an odyssey. This is going to be a really long adventure. This is going to be an adventure where there are going to be times where you're just sort of chilling for a second or relaxing even, and that really set that up for me.
Similar to that, just to reply a little bit, if I'm not mistaken, minor spoilers, there is a section of the game where you actually do need Epona in order to continue, as you are adult Link when you try to get into the Gerudo territory. If I'm not mistaken, your hook shot is not long enough to bridge the gap over Gerudo Canyon. You can't hook shot over there.
I believe
so there's
that
actually
you can long shot.
Is it?
Yeah, if you get your long shot, you can get across.
But
there.
yes, the other option is to use opponent to jump the gap.
Yes. Okay, so that's where that came from.
And when you do use opponent to go jump the gap, I think you get a really cool little shot of somebody's face going, "Oh!"
Yeah,
Like,
yes.
surprise.
Yes,
Yeah.
Yes, you do. But to that point of it being optional, if you don't realize that you can use the long shot, you then have to go back to Child Link and introduce yourself to Epona so that you actually have that pre-established bond in order to ride her over the canyon.
Yes, yeah, that's a good point. I think that now that we've gotten that part done, we have some questions here set up. BC, you came up with these first couple of questions, so do you want to go ahead and read this first one? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, one of my questions was, Ocarina of Time has been described by many sources as one of the best games ever made. And my question is that title deserved? And given how many years have passed since its initial release, is that title still deserved?
Adrien, you want to start?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one thing to, as we talk about this, one thing to bring up is that some sources like to describe Ocarina of Time as a perfect game. And I think I can immediately reply to that and say Ocarina of Time is not a perfect game. Virtually no game is.
No, yeah.
And that's okay. I do think that Ocarina of Time is one of the most important games made. I think it was probably one of the most important games of its time made, and I think the game holds up remarkably well for when it was made and the technology that it was made on. I also think that the game is remarkably ambitious, and that while it's very successful in some of the things that it sets out to do, other parts of the game are kind of left on the floor. And I think that's okay. This was Link's first foray into 3D. This was basically one of the first 3D adventure games ever made, and considering the context, the job that the creators did was absolutely remarkable.
Absolutely. And
totally agree.
And to the point of it being one of the most important games ever made, it introduced so many mechanics that are still used in Zelda games today. It was the first game to have Z targeting to target your enemies, something that is in every or almost every Zelda game since.
Mm-hmm. And not only Zelda games, but a lot of games in general that kind of follow that combat format. But and as important as it is, though, I do think you're right. It is by no means a perfect game. Like, there's a lot of stuff about the pacing and how it tells you where to go next that just aren't perfect. Like, there's like you get to the Goron city and you meet Darunia, and to meet him you have to play Zelda's Lullaby, and it opens up the door, and then you go talk to him, and he just doesn't really want to talk to you about anything because he's got stuff going on. And what you're supposed to do then is go and talk to Saria and get Saria's song, and then that you play that for him. And other than if you take long enough to figure that out, Navi going, hey, maybe we should ask what Saria would do, like, there's not a whole lot of cues as to that being what you're supposed to do next. And I think that kind of problem is all over the game. Maybe not so much as in like Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, but
I definitely agree. And to that point, with having Navi as your constant companion, on the one hand, that's a really, really cool mechanic, especially the way they animate Navi being the thing that helps you keep your eyes on the prize, keep the target because you've got Navi changing color and hovering over whatever enemy you're focused on. That's cool. At the same time, I think Navi in that game, there's a problem with Navi that is experienced by a lot of other of the constant companions through other games. I just recently finished playing Skyward Sword, and the companion in that game, Fi, or Fi, the biggest problem that I have with Fi is that the advice they offer is not always 100% relevant to the situation, or when you ask for a hint, it gives you one of the most general bland responses ever.
Mm-hmm.
And Navi in Ocarina of Time suffers from that same exact thing. For the longest time as a kid, when I first played it, I and my brother were both stuck getting through Dodongo's Cavern because we didn't know what to do next. We didn't know where to go next. And the only advice Navi ever offered was, let's go into Dodongo's Cavern using a bomb flower, which we'd already done by that point.
Yeah, and I think that Navi is very much kind of a kludge. And this was the first attempt at doing this kind of advice-giving companion in many ways, and I think they made a lot of the classic mistakes that we now associate with annoying companions.
Real quick, you said kludge. What does that mean?
That just means, like, it's an imperfect solution.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and for example, the example that you gave with, like, Navi saying, let's go see what Saria has to say when we can't get past Darunia, I think that's especially egregious. You know, it's really not obvious that you should do that, and the only way that you can really figure it out is that Navi tells you.
Mm-hmm. True, and at the same time, it introduces something that Zelda games are really well known for, is that at some point in the game, it forces you to backtrack, to go to those locations you've already been to, and to explore. Which, on the one level, is fantastic, because it forces you to go back and examine all these places you've been to and see, I've got more experience, I've got more items, I've got more stuff in the game, mechanics-wise. How is that going to change the experience of playing the game? Or how is that going to change how I interact and look at all of this area? Which, on the one hand, is awesome. On the other hand, it does make it super confusing if you've not been doing that sort of thing in games before.
Yeah.
So many games are linear path, linear walkthrough. You don't really need to go back unless you have a specific side quest that is required.
Yeah, I think the bad thing with that particular situation is that there's no obvious... The thing that unlocks getting Saria's song is getting Zelda's Lullaby, and there's no clear reason for why that is, and the game doesn't really prepare you for it. So the fact that you just kind of need to know, either by playing the game before or having Navi tell you, I think that's what makes it bad. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about portions where it's easy to get stuck in this way later. But I definitely think that that is a big problem that OOT does have.
And then bouncing off that and the point that you made about how in some games backtracking can be fun because you have a bunch of new items and stuff to play with, I feel like for most people playing through Ocarina of Time, there's not a lot of time that transpires between getting your saying goodbye to Saria and then having to go back and talk to her again. And that means that you don't really have any new items or anything to play with once you get back to the Lost Woods, which is another reason why in that instance it doesn't work so well.
Yeah.
True, and at the same time, it also introduces that other thing that Ocarina of Time especially, and Zelda games are known for, is community involvement. Even with some of the first Zelda games, getting the community involved and, I'm stuck on this, going online and talking to people, or talking to people at a game store, and it forces the community to come together.
Yes.
Which is something that Zelda games especially, I think, are some of the best at doing.
Totally.
So something to add there about the backtrack in that particular situation. The ironic thing is that there is a shortcut between Goron City and the Lost Woods, but you don't have access to it for that particular stage of the game because you can't blow up the boulders.
Actually, you can.
Really?
Yeah. After you get access to Darunia, the torches on the bottom floor will light up. Or you could use the torches in his room chambers to light the torches on the bottom floor. And then if you're careful enough with your Deku sticks, you can take that flame from torch to torch all the way up and use that to light the bomb flowers that are right next to it.
I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah.
Well, there you go.
But it's something that you have to kind of either be told about or find in a guide, because that's how I knew about it, is 'cause someone had definitely told me about that when I was younger.
Exactly, and it gets right back into just people just exploring, trying different things out, and then sharing their discoveries with the rest of the community. And that's how people get through the game, that's how the community grows, and that's how the game experience evolves.
And
Yeah.
it just happened here. It happened earlier with the teaching about the long shot, and it happened just here. So
Yeah, and I mean, in the last episode of the podcast, we talked a lot about that sort of schoolyard, everybody was playing these games and you're swapping hints and everything. And, that's a nostalgic feeling. But at the same time, I do think that games should stand on their own. And when... I think this is a problem, especially for people trying to play the game blind these days, is there are these situations where it's just like, what the hell do I even do?
Totally. And I think a lot of that ended up being fixed in some of the re-releases, which sort of leads into the next question.
Yeah, which is also a couple of the questions I had is Ocarina of Time has been remade as a 3DS game, and there is the potential, if I'm not mistaken right now, for it to come out on Switch. How does the remake or remakes compare to the original? And does the remake still qualify as one of the greatest games of all time, given how many games have been released since the original? And how does its re-release, Ocarina of Times, compare to other Zelda remakes? I know that's a bit of a meaty thing to talk about.
Well, that's okay.
A lot to throw at you all at once.
We like meat here.
Actually, if I could just jump in real quick,
Yeah,
it's
go
also
ahead.
worth saying that there is another remake, which is Master Quest on the GameCube.
That's true. And I've personally never played it. I don't know if either of you have.
I have not.
Have you? Okay.
I have not.
We'll definitely want to
For,
talk about
for the
that.
folks who've never had a GameCube.
Oh, yeah. It was also in the 3DS version.
Yeah, I didn't get that. Didn't pick it up.
I never played that one either. But I mean, I have played the 3DS version, but I never played the Master Quest on it. As far as how the remakes have stood up, I think on their own, there were a lot of little things like the camera control and the combat control, and even just controlling Link in general, are a lot better in the remake on the 3DS. As for the remake on the GameCube, or the port, I should say, which is the version that I played for this, for the purposes of this recording, I think that they had the opposite, which is the camera was worse than it was in the N64 version, and I don't even know how that happened. There were also a bunch of like game crashing glitches and bugs and stuff like that. But the 3DS, which is the more recent remake of it, does fix a lot of things. There's some things that visual cues that make the water temple a little more streamlined, stuff like
Absolutely.
which, oh my god, playing through it this time, it's just as bad as I've always thought and remembered.
Oh, the water dungeons.
Oh, we'll get to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think with the re-releases, the big changes that you see with like the 3DS version, the graphics are a lot nicer. It's much higher resolution. The textures are higher resolution. They have some more particle effects. Even Kokiri Forest just looks much, much nicer. I think they updated the lighting model as well. So just from a graphical perspective, the game is a lot nicer to look at. And then just those little gameplay tweaks as well.
Yeah, and it's not just the gameplay tweaks, it's also they change around the models for everything a little bit whenever they do it. They change a little bit about how all the pots look. They changed the design of the rupee to match more recent 3D Zelda games. They completely changed the design of the Master Sword from the original to more closely match the design that was created in Skyward Sword. Or, well, I mean, Skyward Sword didn't first introduce that
But the
model
updated
of it.
design.
Yeah.
Yes, but the updated design of the Master Sword.
Yeah, there are also some improvements in the game, just like gameplay cues. So we mentioned, for example, improved cues in the Water Temple. There are also some improved cues. When we talk about getting stuck, I'm going to mention a particular climbable wall in Zelda's castle, and it's updated to be much more obvious. You know, there are vines instead of these little brick things.
Yeah, especially in like the darker dungeons, especially like the Shadow Temple and in the well, where they update the lighting and everything, so it's much. Number one, it's much easier to see, and number two, it's less terrifying for all the kids whose adult family members or adults say, "Play this game; it's so fantastic."
Shadow Temple is terrifying.
I still
regardless.
get scared. Re-Deads, when I was a kid, like every time they do that little shriek thing and you're like stunned for a second, like still to this day, but when I was a kid, it terrified me.
The sound of the hands in the Shadow Temple, it still sends a shiver up my spine. It's one of the creepiest things I've ever seen in the game.
One thing I really wanted to add, I had mentioned that the control updates in the 3DS port were one of the things that make it better. The other one little part of that is worth mentioning is that things like the iron boots and the hover boots they can be treated as items, so you don't have to go to your pause menu every time you want to switch in and out of them. And I think your Ocarina has a dedicated button.
Yep.
And
It does, yes.
like that in and of itself is just a game changer.
Yeah, and just to talk a little bit more about controls, on the N64 you only had one joystick. You know, it was basically it may not have been the first joystick, but I think it was the first successful joystick on a home console. And as we know now, you really need a dedicated joystick for camera control. And when you see Zelda-like games these days, they do have dedicated camera controls. OOT's camera control has always been a little bit weird.
Yeah, especially, and that's also one of the things that made Z-Target such a valuable addition to the game and such a key function of being able to play the game is because it's not just useful for targeting enemies. When you don't have enemies around you, you push it and it immediately focuses the camera behind Link at whatever Link is looking at.
Definitely.
It is probably the button you use the most out of any others. I mean, the joystick not being a button.
Yeah.
It is the button that you use more than any other in the game.
True.
Yes.
True. And then to answer the second part of your question about how it stands up against compared to other remakes of other Zelda games later on, like sure we got Twilight Princess and Wind Waker and now Skyward Sword HD. While Skyward Sword definitely added better controls for like you have the button only controls, which are great. And Wind Waker added things like the Speedy Sail, and they shortened the Triforce Quest. The other benefit of that is that you can still play them on the big screen, which, as cool as it is to take Zelda with you portably, like Ocarina of Time especially, I would like to play that new version on the big screen.
Absolutely.
Yes, so I would just say that the remake in general, you probably get the most bang for your buck with Ocarina of Time over any of the other remakes. Just because Ocarina was made so early, it had so many of those a lot of learning happened because of those games. And getting updates for things like, Iron Boots as a item instead of needing to equip it, or, Ocarina on a button, all those little things, you really get a lot out of it. As well as, I mentioned the graphical updates a little bit. The N64's texture quality is really, really bad.
It's nostalgic for me though, so I really don't mind it.
Yeah,
But-
understandable, but especially if you're putting it on a high resolution screen, it looks really awkward.
It's
These
true.
were textures that were designed for CRT.
Yeah, definitely.
And at the same time, that introduces something that you can keep focus on through those games, where if you basically know that, the texture on that's not great, it's probably just background stuff. And as soon as your eye sees something that has more texture, more detail to it, okay, keep that in mind. That's going to be something worth noting.
That's a solid point.
Yeah. And following up on the idea with it being considered items, correct me if I'm wrong here. On the original game, it was possible to set certain items as buttons on the D-pad.
Yeah,
right?
on the C stick.
On the C stick, excuse me.
Or C buttons.
Yes. So that was possible in that game. And since then, there have been dedicated item buttons where you have an action menu where press and hold this or hold that, and you can sort through all of the items, and it's a quick switch from this to this thing. You don't have to go to the main menu or the start menu in order to switch this item out for this item.
I think specifically Skyward Sword has that functionality.
Twilight Princess has it too.
Twilight
For the Wii
Princess.
version, anyway.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, for the Wii version, you basically hold a specific button and it brings up that same wheel.
Yeah.
And you can just sort through. Oh, okay, I want to switch from the boomerang into the iron boots, or I want to switch from the fishing rod into the hook shots.
I think in part though that's to make up for the fact that the Wii had less buttons to assign items to. So like for the GameCube version of that game, you could, just like with Ocarina of Time, you could set up to 3 items to those buttons, but for the Wii you couldn't do that. But I think that problem ended up persisting to later games too, where it's like, yeah, they're kind of designed around hardware that doesn't have as many buttons accessible, except now. I mean, now we're in the Breath of the Wild era where items are treated entirely differently anyway.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Breath of the Wild simply doesn't need the plethora of items because it doesn't have, hook shots or
All that functionality.
all that functionality.
Which brings up the interesting concept for the upcoming game is how are they going to change things, because what they did instead of that, I feel, is they incorporated all these items that you could get that did these specific things and just shoveled them into the Sheikah Slate, where the Sheikah Slate is now your item wheel.
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah, and that works better for like the kind of free open world formula. But since Ocarina of Time isn't that, it's sort of, you still have item locking progression throughout. And so to move on from talking about these remakes, I wanted to ask you guys, do you think Ocarina of Time deserves or needs another remake, like an HD remake to put on a big screen? And if so, what changes do you think would be made that would warrant that?
Yeah, I can start there. Personally, I think I would really love to see an HD remake of Ocarina. I think that just even the fairly low scope remake for the 3DS, I think did a lot of good for the game, and kind of as long as the game's as long as its core gameplay and things are kept intact, I feel like even a slightly wider scope remake would be warranted. I've already come down as saying, I think this game's graphics could really use an update. I've seen mods that do update its graphics, and it looks a lot nicer. So I think it would be great for the community, and it would be great for getting more people into the game.
Yeah,
absolutely. And to the point of updating graphics and all of that, I think one of the biggest differences, sadly I have not found the time to play this particular game, but if I'm not mistaken, Link's Awakening also had a update or a re-release where it completely revamped all of the graphics. If I'm not mistaken, the original game for Link's Awakening is in that 2.5D style, but the updated version, which you can get on Switch, is that
full 3D.
Yeah, full 3D, but it's still done in almost a 2.5, where you've still got the looking down on the world viewpoint, and you're still controlling him in the middle of the screen, as opposed to being right behind him and being right in with him on the action in a lot of other 3D games.
Yes. Yeah, and that was sort of an intentional decision by the team, where the camera angle was more important to the game's feel than the specifics of how the graphics were put together.
There were some things about that, like if you didn't have an enemy to focus on, but you were Z targeting and you wanted to use like your hookshot or anything, suddenly you're in like an over the shoulder or third person. It was like that actually worked pretty well, like unintentionally. Like I ended up happening into that a couple of times when I was just hookshotting around in this recent playthrough, and I thought I really liked that.
In which playthrough, for Ocarina? Yeah.
So like you just like if you're Z targeting and then you pull out your hookshot, suddenly you're just over the shoulder because you're still in that like. It's just like if you were targeting an enemy and you pulled it out, you would be seeing yourself in third person.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think that it would deserve an HD remake, in particular because it is so important. It is such an important and timeless thing, and like you said, I don't think a lot of younger kids are super interested in going back and playing the blocky. And no one's playing 3DS anymore, I don't think. So
Yeah. Very few people will be playing 3DS. So absolutely, I agree. I think it definitely. I don't know that I would say it deserves it, because the remake version on the 3DS fixed a lot of the major problems I had with the original. So gameplay wise, I think it's just fine. However, for nostalgia's sake, if nothing else, I would love to play it on a really, really big screen again and be able to play it using updated controls and all of that, and just the feeling of being able to play it on a big screen once again, I think is the only major selling point for me on it.
I think that's a great idea because you think about some of these iconic locations that you go through in like some of the dungeons and temples, and playing it on the 3DS, it almost does it a disservice. It doesn't really immerse you as much, and that leads into the next question here, Adrien. I think this is one of yours, so if you want to read it.
Yeah, definitely. So my question is what is your favorite dungeon? What is your favorite boss fight, favorite item, and favorite song?
So to start with favorite dungeon, I think that mine would be the Forest Temple, just because I really love the aesthetic of it. It's this like haunted mansion in the woods. Who lived there? Like, what was it for? Saria says, I think that this will be a significant place for us in the future, but there's never any mention of what goes on there in the past. When you can kind of piece together and theorize these four pose, and they have paintings of themselves, so you think maybe those four ghosts when they were alive lived there, but it was such a long time ago that even by the start of the game it's already super decrepit. I also think that it's a great segue into like the more complicated mechanics of the adult Link dungeons. Like you have keys, you have a boss key. Things get way harder and more intricate and intense, and I just think and then finally the boss, this one isn't my favorite boss, but Phantom Gannon is a pretty good way to start your adult Link journey, because it even ends with like a little bit of a dialogue like psychically from Ganon. It's like, hey, you've only defeated my shadow, but it looks like you've gotten pretty strong. And there's also something kind of cool there because he says, when we fight again it won't be as easy, so it's almost like he thinks you're eventually going to get to him.
Yeah.
So he starts to see you as a legitimate threat right then.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think my favorite dungeon is Fire Temple. It's a giant dungeon. It's more of a traversal challenge than a lot of kind of just like puzzly bits. There are a bunch of mazes, there are a bunch of enemies. There are actually very few enemy types in Fire Temple, so there's the combat, I'd say, is a little below average, but overall I think it's just an awesome space to go adventuring in. I think that's, out of all the dungeons, I really feel like I am the hero of time going adventuring.
Totally.
Yeah.
BC?
Absolutely. It's weird to say. I think my favorite was the Shadow Temple. Honestly, there's something for me, and especially with having just played through Skyward Sword, there's something for me about the creepiness of the atmosphere, getting through it, that makes it so satisfying to finally be out of there. So that's a part of it. And the other part of it is that mechanics-wise, it starts using... It's got everything from the previous temples that you're able to use, and it sets up for me that transition from, okay, we're getting through this, we're done with all... This is where I feel like the kids' gloves really, really came off. Like the water temple before it was hard and frustrating, but it wasn't nearly as satisfying doing it because I just got... and I'm sure other people got so frustrated that they just stopped before they came back to it and actually tried to get through it again. The Shadow Temple, for me, having the mechanic of being able to look through the eye and spotting all these hidden things here and there, all the creepy, disgusting enemies, as creepy and weird as it is, there's that part of my brain that loves cosmic horror and visceral horror that I still appreciate about it. And getting through it was super satisfying.
There's some grody stuff in there for a kid's
Oh,
game.
yeah. And the only problem I really do have with it is the boss fight being so underwhelming.
Oh, that's actually my favorite boss.
Well, that's a nice segue. Why don't you talk about it?
Well,
Yeah.
my favorite boss is that, and I think it's mostly just aesthetic. I really like the two hands with the eyeballs on it, and just sort of like, I don't know if there was any kind of symbolism intended there, but I also like the idea that blinding each hand is what closes it off. So like a fist is blind rage, an open hand is like still kind of open and perceptive. I really like having to use the lens of truth, even though I think mechanically it could have been better in the original. They fixed it a bit in the 3DS remake, but I really liked just the whole overall design of that boss. And it's kind of a superficial reason, but that is my favorite.
Yeah, so just as an aside, I believe the aesthetic of the hands with the eyes is, I believe it's like a Japanese yokai. And you see him in other games, like Super Mario 64 has this boss that similarly has eyes on hands.
If I'm not mistaken, it's also very similar to a European movie. It's called Pan's Labyrinth, where there's a monster where a girl is just going through not to touch this magnificent feast on the table. And as soon as she does and stops and she starts eating a couple of grapes, this thing wakes up, smashes its eyes into its palms, and holds it up almost like antlers so that it can see.
I remember that. I think Pan's Labyrinth came a little bit after Ocarina
No, yeah,
of Time.
definitely.
Definitely.
And I wonder if it took inspiration from that, or talking about mythology, it was something that was already within. Because Pan's Labyrinth is much more European in its references and mythology.
What was your favorite boss?
So my favorite boss is technically a mini boss, but it's the Iron Knuckle.
Oh, yeah.
I think Ocarina of Time has, like, its swordplay, you don't really fight a lot of bosses just like sword to sword, or in this case sword to axe, but it's just a really cool, like, you're just sword fighting with this giant buff thing. And it's a really satisfying fight to do. And yeah, there's some ways to cheese him, but it's Ocarina of Time, there's a way to cheese everything.
Right, totally. That's an epic fight.
Yeah, it's a really cool fight. And what's funny is coming back to it after playing a lot of other games, that was one point where I was like, man, I really feel like I'm playing Dark Souls here.
That's true.
Just this giant thing in armor, and you're just like beating it down. And if it hits you, it's like half your health.
And like the more armor you knock off of it, the faster it gets. It's easier to hit, but it's faster.
Yeah.
How about you, BC?
And for me, just as an aside to that, the Iron Knuckle and the Dark Nut, which are essentially ostensibly the same thing, that is probably one of the most recognizable enemies in any Zelda game for me. You see like this great big suit of armor. Oh, okay, we're fighting this guy.
Oh, yeah.
I know exactly how this works.
Yeah.
And getting through it, and I don't quite remember the Iron Knuckle fight. I remember much better the Dark Nut the first time we fight one of those in Twilight Princess, and it just being one of the most frustrating and terrifying experiences. But that said, once you get through it, it then gets degraded, and this is the sad part, where it gets degraded from being a mini boss into being just a slightly more difficult enemy for the rest of the games.
Yeah. And worth mentioning, in OOT, the Iron Knuckle appears, I believe, 4 times. You fight 3 of them in the Spirit Temple, and then you fight 2 of them at the same time in Ganon's castle.
Oh, yeah.
So it gets that space to not be overused.
Which is the reverse in Twilight Princess, because it then just gets overused. Because you see it in the Temple of Time, you fight it there, and then you fight it a bunch more times in, I want to say, the Abandoned Mansion, in Hyrule Castle, and at least twice inside the Cave of Ordeals, where the final fight is versus 3 of them at the same time.
What was your favorite boss in Ocarina of Time, BC?
Oh man, favorite boss in Ocarina. Jeez, you might have to come back to me. I need to think about that one. I need to think about that one a little bit. Just because I remember every boss being special and really, really satisfying to defeat. And I don't know. I'll tell you what my least favorite one was.
We could just do that, sure, yeah.
Yeah, I think my least favorite one was the inside Jabu Jabu.
Oh,
whatever that thing was.
It's pretty nasty.
Yeah.
I will say, just if you see somebody who knows how to fight Baronade, that can be a really cool fight to watch. Because there are a bunch of little shortcuts to beat it faster. For example, all those jellyfish that spin around it, you can throw a Deku nut and it'll kill all of them all at once.
what?
Yep. So if you see somebody who knows how to do that fight, it takes about 15, 20 seconds.
Oh my god.
And they're just like constantly doing things to the boss.
That's so funny. What was the next
Items.
Items.
I think I remembered what it was. Just really, really quick.
Mm-hmm.
It's got to be Gannon. Ganondorf.
Ganondorf or Ganon?
Both.
Both, like
Combined.
Whole two-part
Both
fight?
combined, because you're fighting the same being technically. But I really, really love the multi-part boss fights, and it is one of the most satisfying feelings in the world to finally defeat this godlike, disgusting, terrifying pig monster in the middle of a midnight storm.
Mm-hmm.
And the
Ring
last
of Fire.
Yes, the ring of fire, and the very last thing is there's that final slash and stab right into him. It's still one of that feeling of that final stab into whatever enemy, into Ganondorf and Ganon, especially in all Zelda games, is still one of the most satisfying feelings for me ever.
Absolutely.
Ever. Whether it's Ganondorf in Twilight Princess, not as much with Calamity Ganon from Breath of the Wild. That's a separate thing. Mm-hmm. But Skyward Sword, Wind Waker, it's just one of the most satisfying feelings in the world. Just have everything all come down to that one moment and bam, and that's it.
It's iconic.
It is iconic and it is wonderful.
So, what was the
Alright, so items.
favorite item?
Yep.
BC, you want to start?
I got to.
Alright, I can start.
Okay, go ahead, yeah.
Alright, shout out to fucking bottles.
Oh, man. If I could.
Yeah.
Real quick. So, because I was trying so hard to get through this game as quickly as possible, I think I went through pretty much the entire thing with only one bottle. The one that you get Ruta's letter in. I didn't want to take the time.
You can get 2 so easily, though.
I just didn't. What was the second one that you can get?
You do the chickens in Kakariko.
I didn't do it. I just skipped it.
And there's a thing you get, which you didn't do because you would have skipped going through Epona. It sounds like.
Yeah.
You get it as a bottle of milk from Lon Lon Ranch.
Yep. See, I didn't even step foot into Long Long Ranch for this last playthrough. But I do think that is the most versatile. And it's funny because like when you get it, it's an empty bottle.
Yeah.
And so you're like,
what?
It's nothing.
What am I
It's
gonna do with
literally
this?
emptiness, but it's the most versatile and useful tool throughout the adventure.
Yes. Yes,
So
it is.
the canonical uses of it is, you have milk, you can carry potions in it. Fairies obviously, are extra lives. And you use it multiple times to carry fish, to carry bugs and stuff. However, with exploits, the bottle can also be other things. For example, the bottle can be your ocarina.
Ooh.
Using a weird glitch involving catching bugs, then like backflipping, you can just like play your ocarina.
That's
like play the bottle.
That's so funny.
That's fascinating.
It makes me think of like someone playing like a jug, like just blowing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had to give it some thought because I was torn, and as much as I love having the Eye of Truth and being able to see all that, Bigoron Sword.
Oh yeah.
It's gotta be Bigoron Sword, just because, again, with my love of being able to, that feeling of accomplishment of going through the entire thing and finally, from Kid Link all the way into Adult Link, and spending that time and waiting, or if you use the right songs, skipping ahead through time, finally getting that big blade and being able to use that, and it making so much of the game after it a lot easier.
That was a pain in the butt quest.
It was a pain in the butt.
As a kid,
sorry.
No, yeah, it's okay.
I will admit though that the reason Gannon's fight took me so long was because I didn't realize that after I got the Master Sword back, you can only damage him with the Master Sword. So I spent like 20 minutes going like, oh my god, why won't you die? I've hit you like 30 times now. And it's like, oh, crap.
When I was a kid, and I finally got the Bigoron Sword, I didn't pay enough, or knife, Bigoron knife. I didn't pay enough attention to the fact that he tells you it can break and that it can be replaced. And so when it inevitably did break for me, I was just like, what the fuck? This is so messed up. I spent so much time. You know what? This sucks.
Yeah, and it's so expensive too.
It's so
Oh
expensive.
god, yeah.
So yeah. I think my favorite item would be the fire arrow. Just because it was when I was a kid and I figured out how to get the fire arrow, it was one of those like, I didn't know what was going to happen. I thought I would get like a ruby, because you go to the Lake Hylia, you fill it up, and then right there is that pedestal when the lake is full, fire and arrow at the morning sun. So I played the sun song so that it would just start to rise. I saw the two little posts, and then I fired an arrow at the sun. I was like, oh, there's probably going to be like a heart piece or something like that. And then this like arrow and an orange ball comes down, and then you're like, what is that? You go and pick it up. Fire arrow. You can light enemies on fire. That is so cool. Like, so to me, that was my favorite.
Nice.
Which, as an aside, having magic in a Zelda game and Link being able to use magic and having a magic meter was so surprising to me. Because when I originally played the game, like I said, we never got past getting into Dodongo's Cavern. So going back and being able to play through it and getting magic was such a satisfying feeling.
Because that happens right after Dodongo's Cavern.
Yep.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That is cool.
All right. So next is favorite song.
Mine would be the Prelude of Light, just because I think especially in like the final act of the game, the final two temples and then Ganon's castle, you're kind of going back and forth through time a lot. So if you have the Prelude of Light, which you should by that point really, but you will get it at that point, you're going to be playing that song pretty frequently. And that's also at the part of the game where things seem the most dire. You know, you're going through the Shadow Temple, and before that, underneath the well. You're going through you're going through just a bunch of really dark stuff in that last part of the game. And so to constantly be playing this song, which really does feel very light and nice, is it's a good reminder that there's a light at the end of the tunnel and that you're still working towards. And I think so I'm guessing the Sun Song is your favorite song.
No. It's one of those songs for me, the Song of Storms.
Or some Song of Storms.
Yeah, the Song of Storms for me is, I associate it most closely with playing Ocarina of Time, but I associate it with the Legend of Zelda series exclusively. And it is one of the songs that I feel is just one of the most iconic through the entire series. Just having the Song of Storms and the Song of Time too, especially when you get into how useful that is in Majora's Mask. But for me, the Song of Storms is one of my absolute favorites. And just the way the music is presented, it's so different to all of the other songs when you hear them. Because unlike Zelda's Lullaby, you get taught it. Saria's song, it's ocarina music. You get taught it. Bolero Fire and all of the others are taught to you on a harp. And then there's the Song of Storms, which has its own mechanic and its own use inside of the game, where you need to learn it as an adult so you can use it as a child, and it just gets back into the cycle and how time is a cycle and things just repeat themselves through all of Ocarina of Time, because you teaching it to the guy in the windmill is the only reason you're able to learn it as an adult.
And we're going to get more into the time mechanics and paradoxes and stuff, but I will say that is one of my favorites in the whole game.
Yeah.
How about you, Adrien?
All right. BC already mentioned it, but Song of Time. I think it's really cool. You've also got it playing in the Temple of Time, and I remember as a kid, sometimes I would just like go into the Temple of Time and listen to the song.
It's a really good rendition because it's choir. It's a choir. Yeah, it's a choir.
It's choral music, and I think it's brilliant that they did it as choral music specifically in that sense. Because a lot of the others, it's just music being played. It's on instruments. That's one of the only ones where it's being sung. The only other exception I can think of being Epona's song, which is sung by the girl at Longmont Ranch.
Yeah, Malin.
And it's very suited towards the church-like aesthetic of the Temple of Time.
Definitely.
For sure.
Sacred Triforce, sacred sword, sacred music.
And I think you had the next question too, right, Adrien?
Yes. So back to this one. How does the game teach you how to play itself? So this is something that comes up a lot in doing sort of game analysis from a game development perspective. And one thing that game developers really want to do is make sure that the player playing the game learns how to play the game properly. And back in the day, games would come with a potentially pretty fat guidebook that tells you how to play the game. But as game design capabilities have improved, and as game designers want their games to more stand just on their own, this idea of teaching has become a lot more important. So just to call out, one thing that occurs to me immediately in how to play the game is in Great Deku Tree. Right as soon as you get the slingshot, they make sure that you know how to use the slingshot.
You can't leave that room.
You can't leave that room. Now, that's actually not true. There's a way to get over there without stepping on the thing, and you can...
Speedrunners do that a lot.
Yeah, speedrunners do that a lot. But this is an example...
For a first-time playthrough, when you've never done the game before.
You are going to, you're going to get stuck in that room. So that's just one example of, hey, make sure that the player knows how to use this mechanic, because they're going to need to use it later.
I think that the Deku Tree is a great way to go for it, because of course it's the first dungeon and you get to it pretty quickly. I think even moving up to that point, you have a very small space to explore in Kokiri Village, which means when you have to find the sword and shield, like it teaches you how to find money, how to spend money, and how to look around for the sword. Then once you get to the Deku Tree, the very first room, you're likely to run across that web at some point that's in the center of the room, and then you can see it's got some kind of springiness, and it kind of gives you the idea, okay, maybe if you had enough pressure on it, you could snap it, and that is how you have to pass through. And then in the room just beneath that, when you activate the torch, it burns the web, and it shows you, okay, that's what you need. You need to be able to move that fire to burn that web over there.
Yeah.
No, yeah, it's that exact same idea where, and it's something that I think the Zelda series especially is very, very good at, is as soon as it gives you something new, it forces you into a situation where if you're just playing the game through as intended, no disrespect to speed running or anything like that, but if you're playing the game through and following all the rules, you learn how to use it. And then finding all these additional ways of using it is where a lot of the fun can come into the game, and where you can think of, and so many players have thought of ways or accidentally discovered ways of using these items as ways to give them an advantage later on. Perfect example would be the fishing rod in Twilight Princess. that for me is one of the examples of where they didn't do so well, because all they really give you on the fishing rod is you have a lure that has colored sections to it, and it never tells you anywhere how to use the rod and what the specific way of catching a fish is. You just have to look. Okay, it's at this time. Oh, until finally you realize that these stripes on the lure are how you're supposed to do it.
I totally skipped the fishing in this playthrough.
You don't really need to do it.
No, well, but it comes into that is once you figure out how to do it, it becomes like a minor thing later on in the game until people discovered that you can actually use the fishing rod and cast it at enemies as a way of creating an opening and distracting them long enough to get some major strikes in. You can use it on the Dark Nuts. You can use it on Ganondorf in the final section or in the final phase of his
Twilight
fight.
Princess.
Did I not say that? Twilight Princess?
Oh, you're talking about Twilight Princess.
Yes, Twilight Princess. That's
Okay, I
what
thought we were
was
still
talking about.
talking about it.
No, I was talking specifically about the fishing rod in Twilight Princess.
Did you have more to add on?
No, I think that's about it.
Okay.
But so
Yep.
I think that kind of segues nicely what you were saying, BC, about finding extra uses for items into this next question, which is what do you think of the puzzles in the game as a whole, and which were the most memorable, and did any of them challenge either of you?
Like I said, I got stuck almost immediately. I mean, and part of it being, I had a brother who loved hogging the controller.
Oh.
I barely got playtime as a kid, which is part of the reason why I was so obsessed with the game growing up. But getting stuck into Dongo's cavern was a big one. Getting stuck figuring out how to talk to Darunia was a big one. The big ones, at least for me, are whenever you need to backtrack during the course of the game. If you don't know already that you need to backtrack, or you haven't had that experience with backtracking, or you haven't done it for a while, that's where it'll really mess you up.
So like narrative puzzle solving.
Narrative puzzle solving, especially like when you get further on into the game and you can fast travel to specific locations, like to the Spirit Temple or the Temple of Time or anything like that. Being able to fast travel is a big important thing, especially when getting into the Spirit Temple. You can't do it as an adult. You have to discover it as an adult, go back to Child Link, go through there and start solving it before you come back and finish it.
Yeah.
And if you haven't done that in a while, if you don't have that ingrained in you that you sometimes need to work backwards and go almost back to the beginning in order to move forward, that's where it's really going to mess you up.
That's a good point. How about you, Adrien?
So I've got some more extensive notes on this, and we'll talk about spots where the game's puzzles like sort of fell down, and where we got stuck in a little bit. But I just wanted to share some general thoughts on the puzzles, and then also kind of go through each dungeon and talk a little bit about my thoughts there. So like just overall, I feel like the puzzles in Ocarina of Time are pretty easy. The game's visual language is pretty solid, so it's generally obvious what you have to do. And when it does kind of depart from that visual language, it can sometimes lead to getting stuck. But generally, the puzzles are pretty straightforward, where it's like, yep, you kind of need to kill the enemies, you need to shoot the switch, bomb the boulder, push the block. Generally, within a few seconds of coming into a puzzle room, it's pretty clear what needs to be done. There are a few times where it's not immediately clear what you need to do, and I think that's some of the better puzzles. So like in the water temple, there's a room where there's a single switch that raises and lowers the water, and it raises and lowers these heads. And there, you eventually have to figure out, it's like, okay, at some points I need to stand on the heads, and other times I have to like lower them so that I can get by them. That's just like a little bit more of an interesting puzzle, although it still suffers from the, well, if I can't proceed, I should just do the thing, and I can probably proceed after that.
Yeah, That's true. But I think that one did stand out, the same one that you were just talking about with the... I know that what room you were talking about, because that did stand out to me in this most recent playthrough. And that kind of leads... my point would be that while room to room, most of the puzzles in this game, yeah, they're pretty easy. Mm-hmm. The one thing that is really cool about the dungeons overall in the game is that there's usually one or two overall puzzles that you're solving as you go room to room. I mentioned going lower and lower in the Deku tree, trying to get past those webs. But in Dodonjo's Cavern, you introduced to the big head of the Dodonjo that you need to light up its eyes with the bombs. And the water temple, lowering the water, raising the water, all of that has to do with that. So I think that in terms of overall puzzles, yeah, the room-to-room ones are super easy, but what's really cool is that they're really thinking more about intricate dungeon design than getting each puzzle being super complicated, because mostly they're not.
Yeah, and so the dungeons where the entire dungeon is a puzzle, we had the water temple, the forest temples are arguably a member that you see those a lot more in later Zelda games, and I think they're some of the best dungeons because they're really fun to play. And I think with some tweaks, the water temple would be equally as beloved, but we can talk about it as well.
Absolutely. Having just finished Skyward Sword, the one I can think of immediately is, I forget the name of it properly, but I believe it's the fourth one you go through, where the entire, I think it is actually the water temple, where you're raising, lowering water levels, but what you're also doing is manipulating the giant Buddha-esque statue in the main room. Yeah. Where, there's like specific things you need to find on like the back of this hand, or you need to lift this hand over and do all that. And at the very end, what you fight is a miniaturized version of the temple puzzle.
So it's cool to see, like, going forward with the franchise that they took that to heart, to where it's like, how do we make these intricate, like, what makes a really good dungeon design is like having this big puzzle that overarches.
So I was going to talk a little bit about each dungeon's puzzles in general. We mentioned the web drop in Deku Tree. I'd actually say that's one of my favorite puzzles in the entire game. Like, it's really satisfying. It's not a simple application of like item to switch sort of thing, where it's like you kind of have to figure it out, and like the game pushes you towards it and teaches you how to do it. But it's just a really satisfying thing where it's like, oh, I just needed to climb up as high as I could, then drop down, and it's just a really cool moment. There are a few temples or dungeons in general that are more traversal challenges. For example, like the Fire Temple, the Shadow Temple, Dodongo's Cavern, and arguably most of the Spirit Temple are like, it's mostly about the single, like, you have more or less puzzles, but I feel like the gameplay is more about like traversal. Shadow Temple maybe being the exception there, where there's both a lot of traversal and a lot of puzzles.
But not hard puzzles.
Yeah, especially that one section where you have to get on a ghost ship.
Oh, that's one of my favorite parts of the game.
Yeah. And then also, like, Jabu Jabu's belly, I don't really care for the mechanics of escorting Ruto around. I do think it's really funny using her to kill Shaboms and stuff.
That was my favorite thing, is I didn't realize you could do that as a kid, but in this playthrough I was like, you could actually kill these unkillable enemies otherwise with Ruto. You just chuck her at him.
Yeet. Water Temple. So when I played through kind of with the benefit of being an adult, most of the Water Temple wasn't that hard. Once you get access to that central pillar, and you can control the water to wherever you want to go, I felt like it wasn't that bad.
That pillar, to me, is the thing that always stumps me. Every time I play through the game, and I guess I just wait long enough between each playthrough to forget, I forget that when you first raise the water inside the pillar, there's a little room hidden underneath that floating platform.
And that's what I was going to mention. That was the thing that got me stuck on my last playthrough. Where it was both me and a friend, we were, switching off playing it, and we just got horribly stuck there for like actual hours.
To be fair, the camera does, like, when the water starts raising, you can briefly see it, but it's I don't think it sticks on it for long enough.
Yeah. And I feel like the other problems with the Water Temple have been talked to death at this point, and we've mentioned some of them. Like it's hard to equip the iron boots, but overall, I feel like it's a pretty cool dungeon that's just held back by a few small problems that just made it kind of miserable to play.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's also got one of the most interesting mini boss fights in any game. Going into that,
I want to talk a little bit more about the dungeon's themes and symbolism. I think we might want to talk about that then.
Yeah, okay. Then we'll save that for later.
Yeah. I think that's kind of the extent of my thoughts. I think the last one is Gruno Training Grounds. Probably has the best puzzles in the game, just because it expects you to have all of the items, and because it's not on the main path, it can kind of try to stump you. However, screw the toilet room.
So what are some places, I mean, you talked about where you got stuck at the Dodonjo's Cavern, but how about you, Adrien? What was a place where you just like really got stuck?
So the two places early on in the game, one I mentioned getting into Zelda's castle. I got so stuck as a kid that I didn't know that you could climb on that section of wall. There are like these little bricks that you can climb. Basically nowhere else in the game are there climbable bricks. I think there are a couple exceptions in like Spirit Temple or something.
And probably later on in Gannon's castle.
Yeah, probably. But in general, up until then, the game's language for climbable wall was vines. And it doesn't use that there. And I literally restarted the game 3 or 4 times because I just wanted to play the game rather than be stuck there. Until somebody was finally like, no, dude, you can actually climb that. So that was one place that, I mean, I just got horrifically stuck. And I mentioned that in the 3DS remake, they actually fixed that.
Oh, that's good.
Another place we mentioned this as well was Darunia. Not at all obvious that you were supposed to go back to Sofia. And especially this was part of me getting stuck at Zelda's. Once I finally got that, then you run into Darunia, and then you're stuck again.
You're like, God damn it.
Apart from those, yes, the Water Temple was definitely a rough one. Song of Storms draining the well was like Navi is like, yeah, maybe you should go back to being a child, but you have to figure out what to do.
And again, that gets into that big problem I've always had is if you're not used to doing the backtracking constantly, then it just screws you.
I think that the place that I got stuck as a kid was exactly there. Mostly because you talk to Sheik, and Sheik gives you the song to get to the Shadow Temple right then. So you're like, okay, go right at it. Yeah. And then you get there, and all of a sudden they're like, those who have the Eye of Truth. And I'm like, what the fuck does that even mean? And then you can get past that wall. I just sort of like rolled into it, thinking I would have to like knock it down or something. Like I think I threw a bomb at it or something, and it went right through. And then I was like, oh, you can go through walls in this one. That's weird. But then there's a certain point where you do legitimately get stuck. I think if you don't, or I mean, you could luck your way into it, I guess. But there's spots where you're gonna have no idea what to do if you don't have the Lens of Truth. Yeah. And it takes Navi telling you again, which is I don't think appropriate storytelling or game telling.
Yeah, definitely. I think the other things that confused me, Lost Woods is kind of annoying. Like, yes, there is the mechanic of like the song being louder in some places, but there are also some sections that you can go off and there's still more forest. I feel like that kind of mechanic, that kind of maze is just, I don't like them in general. Where ultimately you end up with a lot of trial and error.
I don't know if it was because I was playing the GameCube version, but when I went back to Lost Woods as an adult, for some reason that music mechanic was not working. It wasn't suddenly louder when I was going the right way. It was just the same volume no matter which doorway I was standing in front of. Yeah,
and then the last one was, for some reason I had a bunch of trouble figuring out how to get into Ice Cavern. Where you have to like melt, what's his name?
King
Zora, I think.
Yeah.
The Mweep guy.
Yeah. The guy who takes a week to scooch over.
That's one of my favorite parts of the game cinematically.
Oh, I mean, it's just hilarious.
Which kind of bounces, I think, well into this next section, which I thought it'd be fun to just tell, more so than we've done already. Just any funny personal stories that you have of playing the game. And I have one that I've been waiting all week to tell you guys. We've hung out fairly recently, and I've just been kind of biting my tongue on this. So for this playthrough, as I've already mentioned, I tried to get through it as quickly as possible, and I'm playing the Gamecube version of the game. My first session, I'm just doing so good. I'm making great time. I'm actually patting myself on the back, oh man, you know where everything is in this Deku tree. And you got through the Dodongo's cavern. You didn't even waste time getting the compass or the map or anything like that. You just going straight through it. All right, Jabu Jabu, I'm here. Hey, Ruta. And suddenly, this is a problem with the Gamecube port. It crashes.
What?
And I hadn't saved.
Oh no!
Oh no!
At all. I hadn't saved at all.
Oh my god!
So when I turn the game back on, I'm hoping maybe at least my profile's made. Nope, the profile isn't there.
Oh, no.
So I had this. I think it was midnight already because I'd worked late that day and I was just getting started and I was so tired and I wanted to be done, but I'm no, if I stop right now, I'm gonna be so discouraged that it's gonna take a couple days to get back to it. I need to at least make some kind of a headway again, so that when I go back, I feel okay, I'm not starting from zero again. But that gave me an opportunity to rename my character. And any game that gives me a chance to name my own character, I tend to name myself something kind of rude.
Oh yeah,
asshole, douchebag, or whatever. But this time, I kind of went a little bit more subtle with it. I just named myself Stupid with a lowercase s. And just because I was feeling that, dumbass, save every time. That's 101 gaming literacy. Just save every time you can.
Yeah.
And anyway, I think...
And every time you talk to someone,
they have
stupid. Your name at the end of it.
It's stupid.
It's so great to see you again.
A few of my favorites were in the very beginning when Navi comes to get you. Hey, stupid, you're finally awake. Or when you meet Ruta later on in the water temple, she goes, you're... If I'm not mistaken, you're stupid, aren't you? Or in the Shadow Temple, it's hey, stupid, watch out for the shadows of enemies above you. It's just constantly reminding me. So I'm
hey, listen, stupid.
Yeah, stupid.
Oh man,
I should call. Sorry.
It's like naming your starter in Pokemon. Oh shit, it's. You get oh shit, it's evolving. Oh shit, he landed a critical hit.
Or Metapod naming Penis.
Oh right,
Penis, he's hardened.
Yeah.
So what I knew once, they caught a Pidgey and they named it Butts. So Butts used Gust.
So it's just been a favorite trope of mine to do with naming, and I've never been prouder of any of my self-given names than in this exact moment, because not only does it amplify how I felt at that time, but it has just made the entire playthrough so funny. Does anybody else have any stories kind of like that?
Oh man, so I think one story that is probably not as funny, but just some of my background was I talked a lot about getting stuck as Child Link a lot, and once I finally figured out Darunia and I figured out King Zora without too much trouble, but basically my playthrough of Child Link was probably 20 to 30 hours trying to get to Dodongo's cavern. And once I finally got there and got to start playing the game again, I was able to get through it pretty quickly. And I remember the moment when it's oh shit, I have all 3 sacred stones. And it's going back to Hyrule Castle and seeing Zelda, that big old cinematic with Gannon chasing Zelda, and then you finally get to the Temple of Time. That was just absolutely amazing. And then you get in and you turn into adult Link. It just blew my mind as a kid. Just holy shit. And in a lot of ways, I feel that was one of my first great accomplishments as a gamer.
Oh yeah,
was managing to do that.
To be perfectly honest, when I played it again, and I came back to it as an adult and as the 3DS version, I had gotten it so into my head that I just want to get through it, and I want to get through it quickly. I want to get as much stuff as possible. There were times where I would just look like a walkthrough, and because I'm a bit of a completionist, so it's I don't want to miss anything. including like all the time between dungeons where ordinarily you just go to the next one, when instead you can explore around some more and go say, oh, okay, I can visit this area, I can get that thing that I might need later, or that little collectible, I can get that one, I can get that one, and just going on the hunt for all the gold skulltulas, and the hunt for the heart pieces and everything like that. I mean, it's satisfying in one sense, and it's also kind of embarrassing to say. I mean, as a gamer and as someone who loves the series so much, it's almost embarrassing for me to admit that I still go to walkthroughs from time to time.
Well, as we talked about before, like, this is a game where if you want to complete it and you haven't done it in the past, you're either going to need someone in your ear or a walkthrough. And so I don't think there's any shame in that.
Spend a lot of time.
Yeah, you're going to spend like 100 hours.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, some of those heart pieces, like, oh my god, the one where you need the skull mask and take it to a particular room in the Lost Forest where you have to do a mini game.
With Skull Kid and all that.
Well, no, not Skull Kid.
No.
It's like Deku Scrubs.
Oh, okay.
It's a really obscure one, and we'll talk about things like randomizers later. But once I had a critical item on that particular check, and I literally didn't know it existed. I finally looked at my spoiler log, and I'm like, okay, where the hell is I think it was Megaton Hammer, and it's like, oh yeah, it's on the Skull Mask check, and I'm like, the what? Look up a guide. It's like, yeah, you do this thing. It's like, that's not real. That doesn't exist. Go on YouTube. Somebody shows it to me, and it's just like, oh, that's what that room was for.
Well, hot damn.
Yeah, that's
All right.
just so obscure.
All right.
Those are some pretty good tales. Maybe I think that gives us an opportunity to move back into some of these questions. BC, do you want to ask the next one?
Yeah. We talked a little bit about this, but let's get right into what is the game's tone and themes, and how does it compare to other Nintendo games at the time?
Yep. So I'll go ahead and get started on that. And just as we're going into our kind of extended discussion on the game's writing, I wanted to first call out that I'm going to be referencing a lot of ideas from the YouTuber Good Blood, since he provides a pretty good analysis of the subtext of the game.
Okay.
And I am not a particularly skilled close reader, so it helps to have somebody helping me out there. So I think you can say pretty clearly that a lot of the themes of Ocarina of Time, you have time, pretty obviously, the flow of time. A lot of the text talks about time, as well as sadness and how those two things interact. And I think that's a very major part of Ocarina of Time's writing. You have the cruel flow of time and other things like that, where Link has been forced into becoming an adult sooner than he really should.
It's true.
Through the power of magic. And also, another major theme is death. All of the sages die when they ascend to sagehood.
Do they? I didn't catch on to that.
Well, they die, or the implications that they are no longer among the living, and
Or
that
in
they
the
become
material world.
Yeah, they become spirits that are then guardians of whichever area that they're responsible for.
Yeah. And, just the tone overall, Ocarina of Time is a very dark game. It lacks some of the wildness of Majora's Mask, I think, which is also a quite dark game. But I think Ocarina of Time actually might be one of the darkest. You become an adult, you come back into Hyrule Castle, and it is destroyed and filled with Reed-in.
I think that does add to that darkness is the fact that you get to see what it's like before Ganon takes over, whereas with Termina in Majora's Mask, it is already kind of dark and twisted in its own kind of fun, crazy way.
Yeah. And, there's a lot of this. You go back to most of the places that you remember as a kid, and they're all messed up. Kokiri Village has been taken over by,
The Dekus?
by, Deku enemies, and the Kokiri are nowhere to be found. Goron City is empty. Zora's Domain is frozen through. And then, you get into the last part of the game with Shadow and Spirit Temple, which are both really dark.
Yeah.
Shadow Temple is its own type of dark, and I don't not light wise, but Shadow and the Well are both dark, and they deal with death and the visceral and terrifying.
Oh yeah,
stuff.
I mean, there's all these like torture devices in Shadow Temple and stuff.
I think because the Shadow Temple and the Under the Well both serve as like two parts of the same dungeon, sort of like, you know, I think every temple has like a young version and an adult version, which is more obvious with the first three. But I think that in the underneath the well, you see a bunch of like prison cells, and in the Shadow Temple, you're constantly getting like these psychic messages about how this temple houses the dark secret of the royal family's history, and so there's some kind of like twisted stuff that they were doing under the scenes, something to do with the Sheikah, who were basically like ninja / secret police to the royal family. Like, this is where they took people that they wanted to disappear. So like, yeah, it gets pretty dark.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think talking about that and talking about tones and themes of the game, it seems like the two biggest ones for me are, number one, not just the passage of time, but age and maturity, and also how history repeats and how time seems to repeat itself. How, like, not just like going through the game and having to go back to being a child in order to progress, and doing, just like I used the Song of Storms as an example, where you look at, just look at that moment, looking at the Song of Storms, where you have to be an adult to learn it, go back to being a child, to teach it to the person who teaches it to you as an adult.
Yeah.
That's one thing. But the other one with maturity is, especially when you go into Adult Link, each of the dungeons seem to exemplify, the adult dungeons to me exemplify the process of maturation, where with the Forest Temple you're still trying desperately to hold on to that childlike wonder and joy from when you were a kid. And Fire Temple, now you've matured a bit, and it's frustrating and hard, and you get angry. And then Shadow and Spirit is fully coming to terms with what it's like to be an adult and the responsibilities you have as an adult, especially with the final boss in the Spirit Temple being two people who are greatly advanced in age. But number one, they didn't really lose sight of what it was like to be a child, because, you know, they still bicker together like siblings do, and they bicker like they're children. And, you know, a lot of it has to do with Link growing more mature as a person, and having the chance to do a lot of that maturation through his journey that he would have otherwise had in the 7 years or so that elapsed since he was stuck inside the Temple of Time.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
And so the great thing is that there's some wonderful text to back up what you're saying, where there's this really strong dichotomy of Link being a child and being constantly called a child. You know, basically everybody in the game, when you're a kid, reminds you that you're a kid. You know, everybody's calling you kid or fairy boy or whatever. Then people start talking about who is a man specifically. You know, Darunia says you have to prove that you're a real man. Or, you know, people constantly refer to Ganondorf as an evil man. Once you become an adult, people keep mentioning it. You know, when you see Ruto, you know, she's like, you've grown into a man. Or when Naboru ascends to becoming a sage, she mentions that, you know, I really wish that I knew that you would become such a handsome man. You know, again, reinforcing, you know, Link is a boy who is, and part of the process is he must become a man.
That's good. It's a pretty good time to segue into this next question that I had, which is, beyond the metaphysical elements that the sages and the metals represent, fire, forest, spirit, etc., what, if anything, do you think they were meant to symbolize? And I know you sort of went into this about the temples, so I don't know.
Yeah, and the temples being a part of Link's maturation process, whereby, and as an aside, if you read the manga for Ocarina of Time, it gets into a lot of this as well.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, it gets into a lot of this sort of thing where, as he's going through it, even he's a kid in an adult body, and he's forced, as part of his journey, to become more mature. That's going to happen regardless, but I've always felt like going through the whole process is a way for Link to gain not only the skills and strength, but the emotional maturity that he needs in order to be able to defeat Ganon and Ganondorf and be truly worthy of being the hero of time and being the chosen hero of the goddesses.
Yep.
Totally. I think that if I were to just go through like a list real quick in my head of all the dungeons, I think that the first 3 dungeons, as well as the first 3 temples, represent the 3 pieces of the Triforce pretty well.
Yeah.
The forest, the Great Deku Tree and the Forest Temple both represent courage.
Mm-hmm.
Even in fact, as you're going into the Deku Tree, he tells you this is going to require a lot of courage to get through.
Interesting.
So we have Deku Tree, he tells you that it's going to be courage going in, and then you have the Forest Temple, which is basically a haunted mansion. You got ghosts, you got a bunch of spiders, you got a bunch of crazy, scary. It's got a very spooky aesthetic. You have that very twisted hallway. You have the first appearance of the hands that come down and snag you and take you up, which horrified me. And then once you get to the Donjo's Cavern, again back in the Child Link era, that's the first time that you come across really powerful enemies, especially enemies that are humanoid and hold weapons, because you have the Lizalfos.
Yeah,
I think Lizalfos holding the sword and shield, and so to me that represents power. And then Jabu Jabu is a little bit more complicated than the first 2, I think. And then again with the Water Temple, they're the more complicated of the first 3 in either adult or child timelines. I think that really accurately represents wisdom. And then moving forward from there, you have the Shadow Temple, and I didn't mention Goron's prison area, the Fire Temple, but I think that pretty powerful. You have a dragon, it's powerful.
It's a megaton hammer.
Yeah.
Is the item that you gain. That's power. And anyone, I think, will agree, getting through the Water Temple is absolutely a test of wisdom. Yes.
And then, but moving forward, it gets a little bit more complicated. I think that the Spirit Temple is a little bit more nuanced. It's I think that one is responsibility, the weight of carrying the mistakes of your ancestors, and also the fear of the mistakes of your past coming back to haunt you, which I think is represented by the fact that Impa, long before the game starts, locked a spirit into the well that escapes and causes a bunch of damage to Kakariko Village. And again, once you're going through Shadow Temple, they talk a bunch about like how this is where all of the dark secrets of the royal family are. And then finally we get into the desert area, and I think that all of those, both the training grounds and the desert temple, the spirit temple, represent justice and balance. People training in the training grounds are learning to be guards and uphold the law. And in the temple itself, you have a bunch of you're having to balance your child life with your adult life because you're using both to get through. You have that statue with the 2 hands open on each side, as if you know how to balance, which is very similar to the scales of fate or scales of justice, whatever that symbol is. And then finally you have the
Shadow.
Iron Knuckle, which is just to me kind of looks like an executioner.
Oh yeah.
So that kind of brings to mind justice and execution. And then finally in Twin Rova, you have balance again, because you have the 2. It starts off as 2 enemies, and then they finally fuse together.
Yeah.
How about you, Adrien?
Yeah, so I think there are 2 things that are really interesting to mention about what these things represent. One really cool insight that I got, again, from Good Blood is that the child dungeons are all associated with the guardians of each area. So, you know, you have the Great Deku Tree, very obviously the father figure of,
all the Kokiri.
Of the Kokiri. Lord Jabu Jabu, also very clear, he's the god of the Zora. Dodongo's Cavern is a little bit more subtle, but Dodongo's Cavern is where all the Gorons get the good rocks to eat, and it has been built out of a giant dinosaur-like creature, with a huge skull and the ribs and everything in the main cavern, which, if you squint a little bit, probably is the guardian spirit of the Gorons, just less subtle, or more subtle. So first there's that insight, and it plays into sort of Link as a purifier, as somebody who's trying to bring balance between nature and humanity. And, when he becomes an adult, it's pretty clear that this balance has been thrown out of whack.
That's good.
However, specifically with the themes of the temples and what they represent for manhood, I am again going to borrow from Good Blood and look at what each of the sages represent for Link's journey, which is that Saria represents friendship. She's an old friend that kind of that Link remembers from his time as a child. Darunia represents family. His text has a lot of talking about family, and Link becomes a blood brother after he fixes Dodongo's Cavern. Water, with Rudo, I think very obviously represents romance. Her entire character arc is kind of built around that.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Ruto is Bay.
Yeah. John, I agree with you that Shadow Temple represents responsibility. Sheik talks a lot about responsibility, about the royal family's secrets. Sheik also mentions protection, which here represents kind of the Japanese cultural concept of protection, which I think translates to really just responsibility again. But Impa is Zelda's protector. She is the one who is responsible for Zelda. So that again feeds back into that. And then finally, specifically for what Naboru represents for Link's journey to manhood, she represents sex. She mentions, she alludes to it on a few occasions. Is sort of dressed in this, chica outfit. At one point, she basically says, "Come back when you're a little bit older." That is something that is, defining your relationship with sex as part of becoming an adult.
Yeah.
Which I think leaves the Sage of Light is the only one who is.
Yeah, but he didn't really get a temple, so.
No, he didn't. He didn't, unless you want to consider it to be the Temple of Time, which
you could.
Which you could.
What do you think?
I don't know. I feel like his would almost be of the 6 sages. His is trying to draw that balance between them.
Okay.
Where you've got Naboru and Impa on one side, and you've got the others on the other side, and he is sort of the bridge between the two.
Mm-hmm.
Where
just like the Temple of Time is the bridge.
Yeah,
between
where his almost, I feel, would be the ability to reconcile those different aspects of who you are.
That's a good point about it. The Temple of Time also being a bridge too. So.
Oh yeah.
That you just said, Adrien. I did want to talk about how well the silent protagonist works in this, and Zelda games in general, but in particular in this one.
Mm-hmm.
This is one. I feel like this is one of the better ones.
Yeah.
To be perfectly honest, because in like most of the other subsequent Zelda games, he's still silent. He doesn't have a voice actor unless you include the people who make his hey.
There is voice actor.
Okay, sure. He does not have any dialogue or lines.
Yeah.
Right.
And for me, in this game, that sort of works. But in this game, that sort of works. In other games, I don't think it does, just because he's got a lot to say in other games.
I also think that when you kind of move forward into games where the world becomes a little bit more realistic, like Breath of the Wild is just very populated. I mean, it's very sparse because of its size, but if you think of sheer number of NPCs, I think it has the most of any Zelda game so far.
Yeah.
And so the more and more people that you have to interact with, and the more normal that they seem, the weirder it is that Link doesn't talk. Whereas in this game and Zelda games around this era, every character you talk to seems like they're kind of in their own world anyway. Like they wouldn't be waiting for you to say anything anyway. They just want to say what they have to say.
Yeah.
So it kind of makes a little bit more sense
Yeah, so when we talked about this last time for Pokemon, I mentioned a little bit about how the Silent Protagonist limits the kind of stories that you can write. And in Ocarina of Time, like you said, everybody seems kind of in their own world because they kind of have to be.
Yeah.
Because Link can't say anything. So, this is one of the reasons that, these early Zelda games have such weird, wacky NPCs that are written so bizarrely.
Yes.
Because they have to work around that. And what you see as in some of the later Zelda games is because Link has been established to be a silent protagonist, they start leaning on other characters to do the talking.
Yeah. Even talking about him or saying things about him.
Exactly.
Perfect example is in Breath of the Wild, when you really start looking into people's journals and stuff, especially Zelda's when you get into Hyrule Castle. Link is normally just a silent person in the game, and it's only once he's had a lot of exposure to certain people that he starts to open up more. And it's the reason that Mifa fell for him, is because he had such a close relationship with her. And it's one of the reasons I think, it's never explicitly stated, but it's one of the reasons I think Zelda, especially by the end of the game, has started to develop her own feelings for Link. At least in Breath of the Wild, but that's a completely different conversation.
Yeah, and I think it's also Twilight Princess, of course. You have you have what's her name?
The girlfriend in the beginning?
No, your companion.
Starts with an M. Why am I suddenly...
Midna.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Midna talks for you constantly, and in many cases you're a wolf and can't talk for yourself anyways. But overall, with the silent protagonist, it's just kind of Link's shtick at this point, to the point that, in later games they start lampshading it. But I do think that it holds back the kind of stories that they can write. Even if he was just a typically quiet person, but not completely silent.
I'm glad you brought up Twilight Princess, because that reminded me of a point that I had that I forgot about there for a second. In Ocarina of Time, you don't come into a whole lot of situations where you have multiple people talking. It's usually you and somebody talking to you. When you get into the Twilight Princess era, suddenly you have like that whole scene in the bar where they're like planning out their next move as a whole resistance, and everyone's just sort of talking around you and you're just sort of chilling there. And I think that's where it starts to feel like a problem.
And I think part of the reason that they do it is because they want it to be this sort of a narrative to the game, where they want the hero to go through this sort of journey. They want this thing to happen. They want that thing to happen. Because part of the I just love fantasy in general. It's part of the reason that I love the Zelda series. It's the reason that I love reading fantasy novels. It's the reason I love playing D&D. The problem I think we get into with wanting him to be a no longer silent protagonist is that if it's a silent protagonist, you can have your own opinions about what's going on, but still feel this obligation to do so. If he's no longer a silent protagonist, if he's actually responding, then you feel like more, it takes that emotional aspect for me away from the game. It takes that emotional investment away from the game, where now you're playing the game and you're controlling a character, rather than with a silent protagonist, especially in Link's case, you are going through the same journey as the character is.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth mentioning that the one time that Link was voiced, it was one of the least successful.
Oh, for the CDR?
No. I will talk about many things, but we will not discuss that.
It didn't happen.
We will not discuss that, and we will not discuss the series.
I think Nintendo feels the same way.
It didn't happen. But I think
just like the Mario Brothers movie.
That doesn't exist either.
What movie?
Maybe the new one will, though.
God.
It's yet to be seen. But I think what you were saying about this particular journey that he goes on here leads into this next question, which is one of yours, Adrien, if you want to read it.
Yeah, so this is the story of Ocarina of Time a hero's journey? Why or why not?
Hell yes.
I think not. Because there's one thing in particular that makes a hero's journey for me, and that is sacrifice. And if you finish the game, if you beat Gannon, much of your journey is erased from your mind. So any lessons that Link learns become... I mean, okay, you remember them, but you don't actually sacrifice anything.
You mean other than losing your constant companion from literally the first moment of the game?
Well, she just wanders off. That's not a result of your journey. That's not something that you had to sacrifice to complete your journey. She just goes away.
Yeah, and then they made an entire sequel game about where the premise is that you were looking for that person.
But Navi's decision to leave does not come as a result of... It's not something that needs to happen for Link to finish his journey in Ocarina of Time. It's just something that happens in the epilogue.
Yeah, so I'm going to split the difference between you two, and I think that Ocarina of Time is a subversion of the hero's journey. There are major elements from it, but kind of what John was getting at there, it subverts it. You know, there are a lot of pieces of the hero's journey with, like, for example, the return home that don't happen in Ocarina. So, you know, the end part of the hero's journey is that you've been into the magic land, now you come back home, you know, with your spoils. Instead, Link is left diminished. Link has lost his childhood. He's been forced to grow up before he was ready. Link cannot return to Kokiri Village, and we actually see that in Majora's Mask, that he is trying to, but fails. The reason is that if you don't have a fairy companion, you will get lost in the Lost Woods and become a Stalfos.
Oh.
Which actually does happen. The Link from Ocarina of Time becomes a Stalfos.
And returns as the Shade in Twilight Princess.
Correct. Similarly, you know, Link has lost all of this time. He's lost his companion. Link is just thrown out into the wide world with nowhere to return at the end of Ocarina. Despite all of these other elements being present. For example, one major part of the hero's journey is the Abyss. I think that's very clearly after... that's when you're locked in the Temple of Time. You know, that is the game's Abyss, and it separates you being a child and you being an adult, which is what the hero's journey is about. You know, you have a early guide who dies in the Great Deku Tree. There is a princess, but all of those elements that are set up in the beginning get subverted after the Abyss.
And to that point, it's interesting how the very first line of dialogue spoken is by the Deku Tree, and he's the first character to die. So, I think this is another one of yours.
Yeah.
And this could be a rapid-fire question.
So, is Ocarina of Time's world design successful? How does it convey that sense of theme and place? How does it affect pacing?
I think that the fact that Hyrule Field is so big is nice, except for the fact that it's so empty.
Yeah.
I mean, if there was more to do in it, I'd be okay with that, but it's really just something that you have to get through. Although I will say, if you know what you're doing, you really only have to enter Hyrule Field 4 or 5 times in the game if you know your shortcuts.
Absolutely. And to that point, it's actually something that comes up in later Zelda games where they sort of fix that, where the big problem that Hyrule Field experiences is it is that big, it is that massive. There's not a lot going on in that entire area. It's there as a way to connect all these different regions, but it's not really there to provide any emotional or hero's journey depth to it.
Yeah, so
which gets fixed in later Zelda games, especially going back to it, Twilight Princess, where you have to travel through it to get to the different regions, but there's also sections of the game where you explore it, and you need to go find stuff that's in Hyrule Field if you want to get all the heart pieces or anything. And there's sections where you're required as an escort through it as part of the game's narrative.
That's true.
So I would say that Zelda games having their equivalent of Hyrule Field be too empty is not a unique problem to Ocarina of Time. Skyward Sword has this problem with the
sky.
With the sky.
So empty and boring.
Yep. The sea in Wind Waker, similar problem. But I think there's a reason that Hyrule Field is the size that it is. and that is to give the world a sense of size. Because it takes so long to get from one place to another, it makes it feel like the places that you're traveling to are far away. If this wasn't done, I think the game would feel sort of too compact. If you could easily go from Kokiri Forest to the castle town, you'd start asking questions like, how the hell have these people not noticed this?
Yeah.
Little fun fact, in the original thoughts process for the game, they were figuring out how they could fit this whole adventure onto a N64 cartridge. One of the ideas that they had early on was to try and have like a Mario 64 type deal where you would access the different areas through some kind of a hub. But I think they decided against that for that very reason. It made it feel less like an adventure. And
Yes. So I would say Hyrule Field is the first thing you see in the game when you turn it on, and I don't think that's a mistake.
No.
You know, especially in the early days of 3D, this is basically one of the first games that is trying to sell you on a whole 3D world that makes you feel like you are actually in it. And I think they sized Hyrule Field correctly. It's just there's nothing there. You know, apart from a couple of holes and rocks, I mean, it's pretty barren. Another thing that, you know, we talked about sort of a sense of size, and while we're talking about pacing, I want to mention that, you know, one of the classic elements of pacing is rising and falling action. And Zelda does this both on the macro level and on the micro level. So on the macro level, you're going to set out on the next chunk of journey. The first thing you do is you travel to it. And Hyrule Field is the first part of that travel, and it's the most boring. There's the lowest action. Then you get to the next part. You know, it might be climbing Death Mountain or going through Zora's River or something.
Exploring a new space.
Yeah, exploring a new space that is detailed and is interesting. It's a little bit more action. Then you reach a town, falling action, but the story is moving forward. And then you do the journey to the dungeon, which might be short in many cases. But then you have the dungeon, it's exciting.
The boss fight.
You know, eventually it culminates in the boss fight and the reward, and then you're back to it. And I feel like the way that the world is designed is critical to this to this pacing. So because of that, I feel that the fact that Hyrule Field is boring is totally fine, because it provides that low baseline of action that the rest of the game sort of uses as a backdrop.
That kind of circles back to our discussion at the start of this episode, which was the fact that it's a very, like, in that introductory opening cinematic, you're just riding your horse through the field, and it's a very calm and mellow song.
Oh yeah.
So I guess that makes sense to me.
And getting into that, and sort of segueing a little bit into our next question is, side quests being part of the Zelda franchise in some form since the beginning, and they got deeper as the games went on. Ocarina of Time is no different. It offered a plethora of memorable quests, mini games, side missions, and stuff. What are some of your favorites, and what makes a side quest feel like a Zelda side quest, and in what ways does Ocarina accomplish or not accomplish this?
Oh, I love this question.
Yes. And for me, a big part of the game, especially when you get into the side quests, is having to go through that entire journey of getting from point A to point B and not being able to fast travel through it. So in that way, using Hyrule Field, turning it into a game mechanic specifically for the side quests. Like when you go through to get the Giant's Knife or the Bigoron Sword, whichever it's called, there's a section where you have to rush from point A to point B as fast as you can and dodge obstacles. You have to climb up this, go through that, and this and the other thing. And then there's other sections of the game where you're just going as fast as you can, or maybe you have a race with that one guy.
Oh yeah.
And side quests, I mentioned earlier that my favorite one was getting the Bigoron Sword. And a part of that for me also involves going through the process of visiting each of these places and having to work backwards a little and revisit places and just going through and exploring the world through a new lens as you've aged up, as you've gotten more experience, and as you have different objectives as you go through it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so ultimately, I feel like I'm not a huge fan of a lot of the side quest content in Ocarina. Things like the big Goron trading quest or the map or the mask side quests are not super interesting. I do feel like some of the other stuff, like the hunt for Skulltula tokens, is a little bit more compelling because it gives you reasons to revisit areas and look at them a little bit different, but it's still not ultra interesting. And the rewards you get from all that stuff is pretty minor. Even heart pieces, apart from your first heart or two, you get enough hearts.
That's true. That's true.
It's pretty rare for your health to be a major problem in the game.
Give me one.
And kind of going from there, talking about some of the mini games and such, they definitely contribute to the game feeling kind of wacky and whimsical. But I don't feel like bombshoe bowling is that critical to the game. I don't feel like shooting gallery is that critical.
If nothing else, I feel that it adds to the game by giving you that sense of this is a completely different world where each person has their own priorities. There's different stuff going on in different spaces, and people are trying to get by however they can in each of these situations where, it basically further establishes for me that this is a world where your role in it is just one life and one story that's happening in the midst of all these dozens of other stories that go on.
Yes,
I totally agree.
by making a living by giving children explosives.
Yep. Well,
With parents' permission.
Different time, I think that really cycles into my thoughts about this, which is I think a Zelda side quest should feel like it expands the world a little bit, and that in this game it definitely does. But like it should force you to interact with some wacky, kooky characters, as you said, Adrien, and it should force you to interact with them in fun and neat ways, which both diverge from what you're doing already, but utilize the mechanics that you're already using. I think a lot of like JRPGs do this a lot, where a side quest is really just going to a spot and reading some dialogue and then having a battle, which is it's a battle. But in Zelda, the side quests all feel different from each other. There's the trading quest and the mask quest that are similar, but very different outcomes. There are the mini games, which utilize the same tools that you already have and kind of force you to even get better with them, and then reward you with an expansion on those items usually. I think the Skeletal Quest is definitely one of my favorites too, just because again it forces you to explore, which I think is a big part of any Zelda game. Skyward Sword excluded. But like to me, a Zelda side quest is that combination of interacting with fun characters and expanding on previously established gameplay. And I think Ocarina of Time does that pretty well for the most part, although in playing through it a third or fourth or fifth time, there are a lot of side quests that I am just going to skip. So they're in as opposed to Majora's Mask, which I think is the best Zelda game as far as side quests go, because that game is pretty much all side quests. And they're all fun, and they're like the next logical progressive step from Ocarina of Time.
Absolutely.
Since we're wrapping up here, let's move into these last couple of questions. How does the time traveling is a difficult element to work with in any kind of a story. It can sometimes overcomplicate the plot while simultaneously making much of it feel like it meant nothing at all. Sometimes it's a quick fix, other times its consequences become the sole focus of the journey. How effectively does the time travel in Ocarina of Time work within the story? And as a game mechanic, does it pay off?
All right, so there were a lot of plot holes with Ocarina's time travel stuff. YouTuber Matthew Matosis did a pretty good review of some of the paradoxes and how they don't make sense. One big problem is that it's not clear how the time travel mechanics work. In some cases, like with the Song of Storms, traveling back in time can affect the past, but in other cases it can't. And this is kind of one of the tensions in the story overall. At the same time, time travel is really hard to write, and I'm not really surprised that Ocarina had problems writing it. I feel like, with a few exceptions, it's not really used as a game mechanic, and it's just overall functional from a story perspective. Yes, it does fall down on closer inspection, but Ocarina of Time isn't a story about the mechanics of scientific time travel. It's a fantasy story, it's fine.
Yeah, and to kind of add to that point, I think that it definitely leans into its plot holes a lot of times. Like we brought up the Song of Storms, that's an intentional paradox written into the game.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a fun way to
as is getting through the Spirit Temple, where it's an intentional paradox that unless you have visited it as an adult, you don't know to go back and visit it as a child, and you don't progress through.
Well, and you can't get there either, because you don't know the...
you don't know the path.
Or you need a warp song to get there as a kid, because you can't go through the...
they don't.
Desert wastes.
No,
So I think the fact that they lean into it is very Zelda, you know, and to me that's what makes it all worthwhile and pays off.
Yeah. If nothing else, I think what it does is the time travel mechanic, it's written into it as a part of the hero's journey or as a part of Link's journey, where a lot of what Zelda games do is they force someone who is a child or who has childlike qualities or who is in the process of becoming an adult, and the games and the journey the character goes through speeds up that process. And Ocarina of Time does that by taking a child, an actual child, and forcing them to mature physically, and then forcing them to mature emotionally and mentally. And in that sense, it does work, though I do agree, absolutely, there's a lot of plot holes and a lot of bits here and there that don't quite fit into the overall story.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like we've been talking for a good couple of hours now. I think we hit all the major points that we wanted to talk about for the most part.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Thank you both for joining me today for this. This was super fun, super fantastic as always.
Absolutely.
Thank you again, BC. Thank you, Adrien.
Of course.
And until next time, everybody listening, this has been Book Club Book Gaming. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and give us a like, a subscription, a follow on whatever platform you're finding us on. And until next time, stay nerdy.
Congratulations, you made it to the end. Time for the post-game.
All right, so this is the sidebar where we'll go over some other stuff and just kind of shoot the shit.
Yeah, love this idea. Because you had put into the chat before this, we were talking about the randomizer, and do you remember the name of the randomizer specifically? The video?
Oh, the video specifically?
Yeah. Let me pull it up here real quick.
So so no worries. So the show is Games Done Quick's random number generation show.
Okay. Yeah.
So randomizers are run by all sorts of people all over the place. But that particular show just kind of showcases randomizers and the people that run them. That's their tagline, in fact.
We'll leave a link in the description.
Yeah, exactly. But so let's just kind of start and talk about how people have changed playing the game over the years and some of the different ways that they're doing it now. So, I think many people, and we mentioned speedrunning, which is where you try to complete the game as fast as possible. And Ocarina of Time was one of the first games that became very, very popular in the speedrunning community. There were a few games before it, but at this point, it is probably the most popular game that is being speedrun.
And people are still finding newer and newer ways to glitch. And
Exactly.
I think in the last year there was an article I saw. I forget what it was, but it was like this person found a whole new glitch that lets you go right to the end from your room or something like that.
Yeah. So at this point, if all you care about is getting into the credits, you can beat Ocarina of Time in under 5 minutes.
That's awesome.
And it involves this bizarre set of picking up stuff and going to weird places and Kokiri Village, and it writes a whole bunch of stuff to memory and then causes that memory to be executed in a way that shouldn't happen, and it warps you to the credits.
That's so cool, though.
There are similar glitches in a few other games. Pokemon has a similar one where you can corrupt your save and it'll just warp you to the end credits. But there's a lot of other stuff in between, your casual playthrough of the game and these hyper optimized, hyper glitchy runs.
Right, like sequence breaking for one. Like this last playthrough was the first time I had ever sequence broken, and it was tough because I was having to do it by memory. I've never done it before. I was like, so just based on what I remember about the game, how can I get to this spot earlier?
Yeah, exactly. And Ocarina of Time is interesting, and one of the reasons that it's so popular to do this is that it's a fairly robust game. But it's also a fairly broken game. So the game generally won't blow up. It won't crash. It won't become, you won't get soft locked if you're in the wrong place. It'll mostly just work. But also, it's broken. Its physics are very broken. Some of its items are broken. A lot of bugs that have ultimately been used were known back on the schoolyard. The bug with you can duplicate bottles by switching the item out just as you're about to catch a fish. Some of the physics breaking stuff was known pretty well. We knew about infinite Deku sticks pretty early if you break it in a certain way. So there are just tons and tons of bugs. And one of the reasons that Ocarina of Time is so popular is kind of like Super Smash Bros. Melee having just the right combination of bugs and just the right community willing to figure out how to use them optimally. Ocarina had the exact same thing. So some of the biggest bugs that allow for sequence breaks, bombs are by far one of the most broken items in the game. You can use bombs to damage boost over gaps that you're not supposed to. You can use bombs to hover into the air. There's another bug that was known back in schoolyard days called infinite sword glitch, where if you put away your sword on the same frame that you interact with something like Navi or a sign, your sword will just be permanently on. Maybe it's you pull it out, or I think it's you stab or slash your sword at the same time that you interact with something, but your sword is just on.
So that anytime it touches anything, it's doing damage.
Exactly.
Oh, that's cool.
Now, one of the properties of that is that you can't fall off of ledges while you're slashing your sword. And that's, that's just a little game design character controller thing, which is, players don't want to slash their sword near the edge. Link takes a step forward and fall off, so that they put a flag on that says you can't fall. Well, with Infinite Sword, now that can't happen, and all sorts of weird stuff starts happening.
And it's useful in situations where you have tight platforming, because the game has all these sections where it's like the game thinks that the controller is very one-to-one, but it's not.
Yeah.
It's very hard to go on these very wiggly, narrow pathways.
There's a reason that there's not a whole lot of difficult platforming in the game, and that's because its platforming mechanics are weird and hard to control. But when you have something like Infinite Sword Glitch, you can hover into the air using bombs. You'll see speedrunners do this a lot, where they do this bizarre dance where they're holding a bomb, then dropping it, and back flipping it with the shield out, and they go up in the air, and they just kind of hover.
And then get to where they want to go?
Exactly. Or they use a bomb and they roll into it with their shield out and then go rocketing backwards and just scream across Hyrule Field in 15 seconds. And this combination of glitches just makes the game really fun to play. And the first thing that people started doing, there was speedrunning. There was also something called playing Uno, or not Uno. what's a game you have the 5 squares and you're trying to make it a line?
Bingo?
Bingo. Hopefully we'll edit some.
We can edit that out.
Yeah, a freaking brain fart. But playing bingo, where you'd put a bunch of objectives on a bingo card, and then it would be go figure out how to do it. And some of them would be like collect a Skulltula from every dungeon, or like get 3 of the 5 warp songs, or things like that, or beat Dodongo's Cavern, and you would try to sequence break as much as possible to get Uno as fast as possible, and you'd be like racing against somebody and to get bingo. So that really started. People want to replay the game. People want to use all these cool tricks, and that fed into speedrunning, that fed into bingo, and then randomizers started coming out, which is where you mod the game so that the game's items show up in different places than they should. And I sent out a video of a randomizer race, like we mentioned at the beginning of this segment, and they can be absolutely wild. It can be 2 people racing against each other on the same seed, so all the items are in the same randomized places, and they can try to beat the game first. But, what does it mean for any item can be anywhere? Well, you could go to where Kokiri Sword is supposed to be at the very beginning of the game and get Silver Scale instead. And it's just like, oh, welp.
No, are you soft locked then?
So that's a good question, which is, there is a concept called like the logic of the game, which is the randomizer knows what you need in order to get to every single spot in the game. So it will know you can get to the Kokiri Sword chest with nothing. But it also knows you can get out of Kokiri Forest with 3-ish items without doing major glitches. One is Kokiri Sword, so that Mido will let you pass. One is Silver Scale, so that you can take the Lost Woods shortcut to Zora's Domain, and the other is Bomb, so that you can get through the boulders.
Oh, so if you get the Zora Scale instead of the Kokiri Sword, then you're not doing Deku right away. You're
Exactly.
Gonna go out.
You're gonna sequence break. You might be able to do it with Din's Fire too. Now that you mentioned that you could set off the bomb flowers. I wonder if it can give you Din's.
That's hella cool.
Oh, it would need to be Din's and Magic, I guess.
Oh yeah. I guess we'll be able to use it.
But so
is Magic one of those too, where you could open a chest and suddenly you have Magic?
Yes.
Oh.
Yes, everything that the game can give you can be randomized. Now, there are some things that are typically not randomized. Master Sword is not randomized generally. I'm not even sure if they can do it. I'd have to check. But so that's generally not randomized. And then also you have settings for like which checks do you want to be in the pool. So for example, you can have the item shops be randomized. So you can walk into Kokiri, the Kokiri shop, and just light arrows are there. And it'll have a random price. Sometimes it'll be like, oh, you can get it for 10 rupees. And sometimes it'll be like, oh, it's 480. Good luck going to find the giant's wallet. Which is just, it can be a real blast. It can also be a real pain. So I talked about when my most recent Zelda playthrough was a randomizer, and Megaton Hammer was in this obscure skull mask check that had been turned on, which was frustrating. But overall, it's just a really awesome way to play the game. So because of this, Ocarina of Time is still one of the biggest games on Twitch. You still see it regularly in like speedrunning marathons. You still regularly see videos about it, just because of this aspect of it where it's just this amazing playground that you can use to mess around. And it's fun because it's the game that everybody loves from their childhood, but it's super broken.
It's great,
Yeah.
especially if you know it so well. Which is kind of leads me to the other thing that I wanted to talk about in this section, which is the Master Quest, which you had mentioned earlier in the episode. But I've never personally played the Master Quest. You have.
I have.
How well does that hold up versus, like, is it really just fun if you're sick of playing the normal game?
I'd say so. So Master Quest feels very much like a harder but less polished version of all of the dungeons. So basically, the dungeon geometry is the same, but the puzzles are different. And I think in some cases, maybe some of the doors and locks are different.
And then it's mirror flipped, I think, right? Isn't it?
Is it? It might be.
I think so. That's what I've heard.
It is fun. It is harder. I'm not sure it's a better version of the game, but it's cool. You know, if you are sick of Ocarina and want a similar experience, I think it's worth picking up. What's definitely noticeable is that you see some of the puzzle elements earlier on. There's some pretty wacky stuff going on in some of the dungeons. Like there's cows embedded in walls and Lord Jabba Jabba's belly. It's pretty wacky.
That's weird.
It's really weird.
So now I want to play through it just to see all that. Like,
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing you would expect in a ROM hack.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
definitely. It kind of does feel like a ROM hack, honestly.
I mean, it kind of is a ROM hack, I guess. Or no, they probably didn't do it off of a ROM, but...
Well, Master Quest was, if memory serves, it was the original version of the game released in Japan. And then they redesigned it for release in the US.
That's interesting.
And then they finally released it on GameCube and on 3DS in the remastered version, just because it's sort of an interesting artifact of something that you can play.
Something that should be... It belongs in a museum.
Yeah. Now, speaking of that, what's very interesting is in the past year, we discovered, I don't know, the community discovered some early beta code of Ocarina of Time with some of the early test areas for places like Kakariko Village and Great Deku Tree and some of the early models. So you can go online and see some of the walkthroughs of that. But what really stands out to me is that the game's dungeons used to be humongous. Great Deku Tree, just traversing through it without any of the puzzles active took maybe 30 minutes of just walking and climbing. And you'd actually go up instead of down.
Oh.
So at the very top, there was like this kind of boss arena or something.
Oh.
Which is super interesting. The story for how they found it was interesting as well. But it's just... it's just one more kind of strange piece of history there.
Oh, do you remember how did they find it?
So early Nintendo, like when Nintendo was doing the development for games, they would have these special development cartridges that they could actually easily write to. You know, if I grab a N64 cart that's just in, you know, my closet, I can't write to it. But these much more expensive developer ones, they could. You know, they could load a beta version or an alpha version of it onto the cart and then play it on the real hardware. Now, this particular cart was used for Ocarina of Time development, and then it was reused for F-Zero development, I believe.
The one for the N64?
Yeah. And what's interesting is that Ocarina of Time, I believe, is a 32 megabyte game, and F-Zero is a 16 megabyte game, which meant that only the first 16 megabytes were overwritten. So there was a whole bunch of data for the Ocarina of Time beta on this cart that you know, somebody was able to data mine out. And that means that a lot of it is incomplete. It's not super clear how things were supposed to be put together. I know they're still working on, like, can we revive some of the puzzles and stuff. In order to get it to run at all, they basically needed to take a ROM hack of the real Ocarina of Time, take the map file and like kind of shove it in there, debug style. But it's fascinating to see how the developers thought about it early on and what they eventually got out of it.
That's so cool. Yeah. Was that about the end?
Yeah, I think that's about all I have to talk about there.
All right, so that wraps up our post-game, how the game changes segment. And till next time, everybody, stay nerdy.